He had $1 million smile, but every time he flashed it on screen, it cost him a piece of his soul. Look at the classic movies, and you will see Bill Robinson happily tap dancing behind a little white girl. Turn off the music, however, and the reality is sickening. He was the undisputed genius of vaudeville, yet a deeply segregated Hollywood stripped him of his dignity. They refused to cast him as anything other than a grinning, subservient butler. He gave his life to an industry that exploited his talent and left him to die penniless. How did this bitter paradox begin? The answer lies far from the California studios. It is rooted in the unforgiving reality of the post-war South, specifically Richmond, Virginia, in 1878. The American Civil War had ended just 13 years earlier. The battlefield combat was over, but a new insidious legal framework was taking its place. This was the dawn of the Jim Crow era. It was not just a set of discriminatory laws printed on paper. It was a suffocating atmosphere that dictated daily existence. It controlled exactly where a person could walk and where they could look. Navigating the streets of Richmond was a strict matter of survival. A misplaced gaze or failing to step off the pavement for a white citizen could invite brutal violence. The unwritten rule was absolute. A black life was legally treated as a fraction of a white one. Into this hostile environment, Luther Robinson was born. His parents, Maxwell and Maria, had been born into slavery. Following emancipation, Maxwell labored heavily in a machine shop, while Maria possessed a beautiful singing voice that graced the local church choir. They lived in the Jackson Ward neighborhood, while it would later blossom into a vibrant cultural hub known as the Harlem of the South. In the late 1870s, it was a place of grueling poverty and relentless daily struggle. The structural cruelty of the era was soon compounded by swift, devastating personal tragedy. By the time young Luther reached the age of 7, both Maxwell and Maria had died. The historical record remains fragmented regarding the exact medical causes of their passing, reflecting the tragic indifference the state held towards black mortality at the time. What is profoundly certain is the immediate aftermath. Luther and his younger brother Bill were thrust into the care of their grandmother, Bedelia. She was a woman forged in the brutal crucible of slavery, deeply religious, fiercely strict, and entirely unequipped to manage the boundless, restless energy of a grieving orphan boy. Even as a young child, Luther exhibited a fierce, almost feral refusal to accept the conditions imposed upon him. He harbored a deep resentment for his given name, feeling it did not belong to him. In a visceral act of self-determination, he physically fought his younger brother, demanding to take the name Bill for himself. He won the brawl, and the boy named Luther ceased to exist. Bill Robinson emerged, a child who realized with terrifying clarity that if he were to survive in a world that offered him no safety net, no inheritance, and no protection, he would have to rely entirely on his own wits and his own body. He quickly abandoned formal education. The classroom offered nothing that could put food in his stomach. Instead, he took to the cobbled streets of Richmond with a wooden shoeshine box, slung over his shoulder. The shoeshine box was a symbol of servitude, precisely what white society expected of a young black boy. Yet Bill manipulated this expectation. Amidst the dust and the spit of the pavement, his genius first began to flicker. He was a street urchin begging for coppers, but he was also an acoustic sponge, absorbing the harsh mechanical landscape of a rapidly industrializing city. He listened intently to the syncopated clatter of horse hooves striking the cobblestones, the rhythmic, heavy chugging of the steam trains pulling into the station, and the sharp, percussive snapping of polishing rags against leather shoes. He began to translate the noise of the city into kinetic movement. He possessed no money for instruments, nor access to formal dance academies. His instrument became the street itself. He began busking outside the local theater and saloons, combining his shoeshine duties with impromptu, frantic dance routines. He scuffed, tapped, and hammered his bare feet, and later cheap wood-soled shoes, against the pavement to attract the attention of wealthy, white patrons. This was not yet refined art. It was a pure, desperate survival mechanism. The pennies tossed onto the dirt kept him from starving. Yet, even in these raw, unpolished street performances, passing observers noted an unusual, captivating precision. He was not just thrashing about for attention. He was keeping perfect, complex time. He was creating a percussive dialogue with a world that had otherwise entirely silenced him. It was a harsh, unforgiving childhood that forced a young boy to weaponize his own rhythm. He learned early the deeply transactional nature of a smile. He discovered that if he grinned broadly enough, hiding his grief and his hunger, and moved his feet fast enough, the oppressive, hostile world around him would briefly soften, dropping coins into his hands before turning their backs. He was actively learning the rules of a theatrical game he would be forced to play for the rest of his life. By the age of 12, the confines of Richmond had become unbearable. Driven by a restless ambition and a desperate hunger for autonomy, he did what many disenfranchised youths of his generation attempted. He ran. Stowing away in a darkened freight car, shivering amidst the cargo, the young boy made his way north to Washington, D.C. He was a runaway, completely alone in the capital of a nation that barely recognized him as a human being, let alone a citizen. In Washington, the struggle for survival merely shifted its shape. He found work at the local racetracks, an environment teeming with gamblers, hustlers, and hard men. He exercised horses, ran exhausting errands, and slept wherever he could find a dry patch of straw. The racetrack was a ruthless, transactional world, but it was also an incredible crucible that sharpened his street smarts. He learned how to read a volatile crowd, how to anticipate the desires of wealthy men, and how to use his sharp observational wit to diffuse tension and secure a tip. When the racing season ended and the cold set in, he returned to the only reliable trade he knew. He went back to busking, dancing outside saloons and theaters in the freezing rain, his feet moving with an ever-increasing furious complexity, waiting for a door to open into a world that was determined to keep him firmly on the outside. The freezing streets of Washington, D.C. could only teach a man so much about survival before his ambition demanded a grander arena. For a kinetic, restless talent like Bill Robinson, the only logical destination at the dawn of the 20th century was vaudeville. His subsequent achievements can only be measured against the absolute dominance of the vaudeville circuit. It was the glittering, pulsing heartbeat of American entertainment, a sprawling network of thousands of theaters stretching from the bustling avenues of New York to the dust-choked towns of the Midwest. It was a place where fortunes were minted, where legends were born, and where the masses went to escape the grinding reality of the industrial age. However, for a black artist, stepping out of the cold night and into the warmth of a vaudeville theater did not mean leaving Jim Crow at the door. The racism of the era was not suspended inside the auditorium. It was simply theatricalized. The vaudeville stage was a meticulously engineered psychological obstacle course, governed by unwritten, ironclad laws designed to ensure that white audiences were never threatened by black brilliance. The most insidious of these barriers was known as the two-colored rule. The American Entertainment Syndicate had decreed that a black performer was fundamentally incapable, or perhaps too dangerous, to command a stage alone. A black man could not be presented as a singular standalone genius. He was required by the industry standard to be part of a duo. This pairing usually mandated a dynamic of the straight man and the fool, deliberately diluting any individual artistry into safe, manageable, and often demeaning comedy. To survive, Robinson initially bowed to this architecture of subjugation. He formed a traveling partnership with another talented performer, George W. Cooper. As the act of Cooper and Robinson, they navigated the grueling, often hostile circuits, slowly building a formidable reputation for their impeccable comedic timing and Robinson's increasingly sophisticated footwork. Yet an even darker, more humiliating mandate loomed over black performers of the era, the minstrel tradition. It was an expectation that poisoned the very soul of American theater. It was not merely that white performers mocked black people by blackening their faces. The system perversely demanded that black artists do the same. To secure a booking, black men were routinely forced to apply burnt cork to their own skin, painting grotesque, exaggerated white smiles over their own lips. They were compelled to parody themselves, to don a mask of manufactured ignorance, and to present a caricature of the happy plantation darky. It was a ritualistic stripping of humanity, a visual confirmation of white supremacy enacted night after night under the spotlight. This was the entry fee for a black man seeking a living wage in the theater. It is here, in the dim, cramped dressing rooms of the vaudeville circuit, that the feral street urchin from Richmond truly transformed into a man of iron conviction. While many of his peers tearfully submitted to the burnt cork, justifying it as a necessary evil to feed their starving families, Bill Robinson made a staggering, profoundly dangerous decision. He drew a line in the sand. He flatly refused. He looked at the burnt cork, and he looked at the theater managers who held his livelihood in their hands, and he said no. Historical theater scholars point to this refusal as one of the most significant, yet tragically underreported acts of civil rights defiance in early American entertainment. One must pause to consider the sheer audacity of this act. A black man in the early 1900s, completely devoid of institutional power or legal protection, was looking white authority in the eye and denying them their required humiliation. Robinson demanded to be seen precisely as he was, a man with sharp features, impeccable grooming, a razor-sharp intellect, and a dignified presence. He would dance for them, he would make them laugh, but he absolutely refused to degrade his own flesh to provide them comfort. He would not wear the mask. This quiet, steadfast rebellion set the stage for an even more monumental leap. The partnership with George W. Cooper, though successful, was volatile. When the duo inevitably fractured due to offstage tensions and an incident involving the law, Robinson found himself standing at a terrifying precipice. He was alone. The tyrannical two-colored rule dictated his next move: find another partner immediately, or be banished from the vow. DeVille circuits and return to the unforgiving streets. Instead of complying, Robinson chose to shatter the rule entirely. Driven by an unshakable belief in his own magnetic capability, he stepped out onto the vaudeville stage as a solo act. He was unmasked, unaccompanied, and utterly exposed. A black man, standing entirely alone under the spotlight, demanding the undivided attention and respect of a white audience, armed with nothing but his own 2 feet. It was a breathtaking gamble that defied the established racial physics of the era. He forced the American entertainment machine to look at him not as half of a comedic distraction, but as a singular, undeniable artist. He had broken the architectural rules of who was permitted to perform. Now he was about to completely revolutionize how they performed. When Bill Robinson shattered the theatrical syndicate's ironclad 2-color rule, he found himself entirely alone under the blinding heat of the vaudeville spotlight. This isolation was unprecedented for a black artist, and the pressure was immense. If he failed to hold the crowd, the industry gatekeepers would simply point to his failure as absolute proof that a black man could not command a stage without a comedic crutch. He was granted a dangerously narrow window to justify his audacity. Robinson did not just survive this exposure, he used the empty stage to completely dismantle and rebuild the American art of dance. His genius is best understood against the physical landscape of stage dancing in the 1910s. At the time, tap dancing, frequently dismissed as hoofing or the buck and wing, was a deeply grounded, flat-footed affair. Performers hammered their entire souls into the wooden floorboards. It was an athletic, exhausting display of brute force, characterized by a frantic, hunched posture and wildly swinging arms. It was noisy, chaotic, and widely regarded by cultural critics as a lowbrow, novelty distraction. It was a dance heavily bound by gravity, hauling the performer down towards the dirt. Robinson changed the fundamental physics of the art form. He made a deliberate anatomical shift that would alter the course of rhythmic expression forever. He lifted his heels. By shifting his entire body weight forward onto the balls of his feet and his toes, he instantly defied the heavy gravity of the era. This was not merely a stylistic choice. It was an act of profound physical discipline, requiring immaculate balance and immense core strength. He traded the blunt force of a hammer for the precision of a scalpel. This physical elevation radically transformed his entire presence on stage. Archival footage and theatrical reviews from the era reveal a man who categorically refused to hunch or scramble. Robinson stood fiercely upright. His spine was straight, his chest open, his head held high. He performed in immaculate, tailored suits, often topped with a perfectly tilted bowler hat. He did not look like a frantic entertainer begging for applause. He looked like an aristocrat commanding an audience. His posture alone was a silent, radical declaration of dignity in an era that legally demanded his subjugation. The acoustic result of this technique was mesmerizing. Because his heels rarely struck the floor, the heavy, muddy clatter of traditional hoofing vanished. In its place, Robinson created a crisp, clean, and fiercely articulate polyrhythm. He was no longer just a dancer, he was a percussionist. His feet held rapid, complex conversations with the orchestra. He could drop the volume of his taps to a mere whisper, a delicate sound like raindrops hitting glass, forcing theaters packed with thousands of people to hold their breath and lean forward just to listen. He had taken a noisy street hustle and elevated it into high chamber art. This relentless pursuit of acoustic perfection culminated in his undisputed masterpiece, the stair dance. Around 1918, Robinson introduced a deceptively simple prop to his act. It was a custom-built, dual set of wooden stairs. He did not merely dance on the flat stage, he began to dance up and down the steps. Each wooden tread, cut to a specific dimension, produced a slightly different pitch. By treating the staircase as a massive multi-tonal xylophone, he generated complex melodies solely with his feet. The mechanics of this routine were a marvel of spatial awareness. He would tap intricate rhythms while ascending forwards, and then, without missing a single microscopic beat, he would dance backwards down the steps. It was fluid, mathematical, and incredibly dangerous. One misplaced toe would result in a humiliating fall. Yet, he smiled warmly at the audience the entire time, projecting an aura of total relaxation. He chatted lightly, telling jokes, while executing a routine of punishing physical difficulty. The effort was entirely concealed. This was the absolute essence of his genius, making the impossible look like a casual, effortless stroll. Many cultural historians argue that the stair dance carried a much deeper, unstated resonance. In the brutal context of early 20th century America, where the social and economic mobility of a black man was violently restricted, the image of Bill Robinson was profoundly symbolic. Every night, on the stages across the segregated country, a sharply dressed black man was seen elegantly, deliberately, and triumphantly stepping upwards. He was ascending. He was occupying higher ground. Without uttering a single political slogan, his physical upward mobility on those stairs spoke volumes to a marginalized community desperate for elevation. By the 1920s, this elegant architectural mastery of sound propelled him to the absolute zenith of the theatrical world. He conquered the Palace Theater in New York City, the undisputed holy grail of the vaudeville circuit. He became a headline act, commanding exorbitant salaries and drawing massive, fiercely loyal crowds of both black and white patrons. He was no longer just Luther, the orphaned shoeshine boy from the streets of Richmond. He was globally recognized by a new, iconic moniker, Bojangles. While the exact origins of the nickname remain debated among scholars, some claim it meant happy-go-lucky, others suggest it referred to his relentless kinetic energy. It became a universally recognized synonym for rhythmic perfection. He had built an empire using nothing but his toes and a set of wooden steps. Yet, this phenomenal independent success in the theater would soon attract the gaze of a much larger and far more dangerous industrial machine. By the dawn of the 1930s, the glittering landscape of American entertainment was undergoing a brutal seismic shift. The stock market had collapsed, plunging the nation into the devastating grip of the Great Depression. The magnificent vaudeville theaters, once the pulsing cathedrals of live performance, were rapidly going dark, their immense stages repurposed or abandoned. In their place rose a new monolithic empire in the West, Hollywood. The silver screen was the new currency of fame, offering a global reach that the stage could never match. For a man like Bill Robinson, now in his 50s, an age when the physical demands of tap dancing typically force a quiet retirement, the transition to cinema was not merely a career progression. It was an absolute necessity for survival. Hollywood beckoned, promising a level of wealth and visibility that was historically unprecedented for a Black American. Robinson arrived in California not as a struggling novice, but as an established aristocrat of the stage. The film studios, desperate for bankable talent to distract a starving nation, recognized the sheer magnetic power of his footwork. They offered him contracts that defied the brutal economic reality of the era. While millions of Americans stood shivering in breadlines, Robinson was generating a staggering fortune. He became the highest-paid Black entertainer in the United States, earning an estimated $2 million throughout the decade. He lived a life of unapologetic, conspicuous consumption. He drove custom-built Duesenberg motor cars, painted in dazzling shades of gold. He commanded a lavish wardrobe of tailored suits, tipping wait staff with $100 bills, and maintaining residences on both coasts. To the casual observer, he had conquered the ultimate American dream. However, this immense wealth was not a measure of liberation. It was the price of his artistic surrender. The Hollywood studio system of the 1930s was a ruthlessly pragmatic machine, fundamentally terrified of alienating the white ticket-buying public, particularly the deeply segregated audiences of the American South. The studio executives knew exactly what they had bought in Bill Robinson, an explosive, sophisticated, and fiercely independent artistic genius. But they also knew they could never, under any circumstances, allow that man to appear on film. To present Robinson as the sharp, commanding, and impeccably dressed pioneer he truly was would have fundamentally challenged the racial hierarchy of the nation. It would have presented a black man as an equal, or perhaps a superior, to the white leading men of the era. This was a cinematic impossibility. Therefore, the studio bosses constructed a highly lucrative trap. They would pay him his millions. They would feature his legendary footwork, but only if he agreed to be stripped of his autonomy, his intellect, and his masculinity on screen. He was forced into a highly lucrative, but spiritually suffocating mold. He was permanently cast as the happy servant. In film after film, Robinson was relegated to the roles of butlers, chauffeurs, porters, and docile plantation workers. He was never permitted to be a romantic lead. He was never allowed to portray a man with his own family, his own ambitions, or his own internal conflicts. His characters possessed no narrative agency. They existed solely within the orbit of witty protagonists. He was the perpetual uncle. He became a comforting, neutered presence on screen. His only purpose was to offer folksy advice and break into spontaneous dance, strictly to alleviate the troubles of his white employers. The studios took the aristocrat of vaudeville and dressed him in the livery of subservience. The most iconic and perhaps the most complex manifestation of this golden cage was his legendary on-screen partnership with the child star Shirley Temple. Beginning with the film The Little Colonel in 1935, the pairing of the aging black master and the cherubic white girl became a box office sensation. From a purely choreographic standpoint, the sequences they filmed together are undeniably masterful. Robinson meticulously taught Temple his routines, patiently adapting his complex rhythms so that her small feet could match his precisely. When they danced up the stairs together holding hands, it was a moment of unprecedented cinematic history. It was the first time a black man and a white girl had danced hand in hand on an American cinema screen. It was a visual crack in the bedrock of segregation, a moment of genuine transcendent charm that captivated a fractured nation. Yet, beneath the glossy veneer of these beloved films lies a deeply unsettling power dynamic. We must remember who Bill Robinson was, a man in his late 50s, a hardened survivor of the streets, a millionaire, and the undisputed king of his art form. Yet, on screen, he was reduced to the status of a magical playmate for a 6-year-old child. His character's entire universe revolved around ensuring the happiness of a little white girl. He was not her teacher or her guardian in the narrative. He was a piece of animate property, a beloved servant who happily tapped his way through subjugation. The psychological toll of this compromise must have been staggering. Robinson was an intensely proud man, known off-screen for his quick temper and his refusal to tolerate racial slurs. He carried a gold-plated revolver and was not afraid to use his fist to defend his dignity in the streets. Yet, the moment the cameras rolled, he was required to swallow his pride, widen his eyes, and flash a dazzling, unthreatening smile. It was an exhausting, relentless performance of compliance. He knew with absolute certainty that if he dropped the smile, if he demanded a role with gravity or dramatic weight, the studio gates would instantly slam shut. The millions would vanish. He had successfully avoided the physical burnt cork of the vaudeville days, only to find that Hollywood had forced him to wear a different kind of mask. It was a mask forged of celluloid and immense wealth, a smiling facade that concealed the quiet outrage of a captive genius. He was universally beloved, exceptionally rich, and entirely trapped. The architecture of his confinement was invisible, built upon lucrative contracts and global adulation, but it was a cage nonetheless. And as the decade progressed, the walls of this golden cage would begin to suffocate him, creating a profound, agonizing fracture between the man he was forced to play and the man he truly was. The illusion of Robinson's Hollywood stardom was built upon a profound geographical hypocrisy. The true cruelty of his cinematic existence reveals itself not in the glowing reviews of New York broadsheets or the premiere screenings in Los Angeles, but in the physical journey of the film, reels themselves as they left the progressive, metropolitan centers of the North and crossed the Mason-Dixon line into the deeply segregated American South. It was here, in the vast territories governed by Jim Crow, that the illusion of Robinson's universal stardom was violently shattered by the scissors of regional censors. When the major studios, particularly 20th Century Fox, paired Robinson with the child phenomenon Shirley Temple, they were acutely aware they were playing with cultural dynamite. The imagery of a black man holding the hand of a white female child, even one as young as Temple, was considered a direct assault on the strict racial orthodoxies of the Southern states. The Southern box office was a massive, indispensable source of revenue for the film industry, and local theater managers held immense power. They operated under strict mandates from local censorship boards, which were utterly terrified that displaying any form of affectionate, egalitarian interaction between the races on screen might incite social upheaval or threaten the established white supremacy. Consequently, a brutal systematic erasure took place in the projection booths of theaters, from Georgia to Texas, and painfully in Robinson's own birthplace of Virginia. When films like The Little Colonel or Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm arrived in southern towns, the projectionists were routinely instructed to physically butcher the celluloid. They took razor blades and splicing tape to the reels, deliberately cutting out the historic, groundbreaking dance sequences between Robinson and Temple. The audiences in Atlanta or Richmond would see Shirley Temple skip up to the staircase. The frame would jarringly jump and the scene would suddenly transition to the next plot point. Bill Robinson, the highest paid black entertainer in the world, was simply deleted from the narrative. This was not a random act of local prejudice. It was a premeditated betrayal engineered by the Hollywood studio system itself. The studio executives in California knew precisely what the Southern censors would demand. To protect their investments, they deliberately structured the screenplays and directed the camera operators to ensure that Robinson's scenes were entirely expendable. His magnificent tap routines were filmed as isolated vignettes, almost like standalone variety acts dropped into the middle of the film. They rarely advanced the primary storyline. They were structurally designed to be excised without rendering the rest of the film incomprehensible. The studios actively enabled his erasure, providing the South with a perfectly tailored segregated version of their product. They profited massively from his presence in the North while silently cooperating with his obliteration in the South. It is one matter to be denied entry to a theater. It is an entirely different level of psychological torture to be invited inside, paid a fortune to perform your absolute best, and then have the physical evidence of your existence surgically removed because your very image is deemed a contaminant. Robinson was an extraordinarily intelligent man. He read the trade papers. He spoke with touring musicians and Pullman porters who traveled the Southern rails. He knew exactly what was happening to his films. He knew that in Richmond, the very city where he had once danced on the cobblestones for pennies, his artistic triumphs were being systematically thrown onto the cutting room floor. Imagine the profound indignity of that realization. He had fought his way out of the gutters of Virginia. He had broken the two-color rule of vaudeville. He had revolutionized an entire art form and amassed a fortune that rivaled the titans of industry. Yet despite all of his wealth, his bespoke Duesenbergs, and his tailored suits, he could not purchase his own cinematic existence in half of his own country. To the Southern establishment, he was not a millionaire. He was not a genius. He was a ghost that needed to be exorcised from the silver screen. This blatant hypocrisy, being a beloved icon in New York and an offensive deletion in Mississippi, exposed the absolute limits of his success. It proved that in the eyes of the American power structure, his wealth did not buy him humanity. It merely bought him a more luxurious form of subjugation. He was permitted to be famous, but he was strictly forbidden from being equal. The applause he received in the North was consistently hollowed out by the silent, violent cuts made in the South. He was a global star who was fundamentally not allowed to exist wholly in his own homeland. This state of permanent structural humiliation festered beneath his impeccable public persona. The constant requirement to smile for the cameras while knowing his work was being mutilated created an immense, unspeakable pressure. A man can only swallow his pride for so long before the internal architecture begins to crack. Denied the ability to fight back against the studio bosses or the Southern censors without destroying his livelihood, Robinson sought other, far more destructive avenues to assert his power and vent his quiet, suffocating outrage. The cheerful, subservient uncle portrayed on the silver screen was a fiction. The real Bill Robinson was a man slowly being consumed by the toxic compromise of his own survival, driving him towards a dangerous precipice of self-destruction and silent, desperate rebellion. The mutilation of his films in the projection booths of the American South was a profound professional humiliation, but the most devastating wounds Bill Robinson suffered were inflicted far away from the censors of Georgia or Texas. The deepest cuts came from the vibrant, intellectual epicenters of his own community. As the 1930s bled into the 1940s, the cultural landscape of Black America was rapidly evolving. A new, fiercely vocal generation of artists, writers, and activists was rising in neighborhoods like Harlem and the South Side of Chicago. They were hardened by the Great Depression, acutely aware of the systemic injustices they faced, and increasingly militant in their demands for civil rights. When this new generation looked up at the silver screen, they did not see a pioneer who had ingeniously broken the color barrier. They saw an embarrassment. To these younger, radicalized audiences, Robinson's survival strategy looked indistinguishable from surrender. They watched him shuffling behind white child stars, offering wide, subservient grins, and po-aing the perpetual, unthreatening servant. They did not understand, or perhaps simply could not forgive, the brutal compromises he had been forced to make decades earlier just to stand on a stage. They judged him by the standards of a new era, an era that demanded resistance rather than accommodation. Consequently, a devastating label was attached to him, one that would haunt him to his grave. They called him an Uncle Tom. In the lexicon of Black American history, there is perhaps no epithet more spiritually crushing. To be labeled an Uncle Tom is to be accused of the ultimate betrayal. It signifies a person who actively collaborates in their own subjugation, an individual who sells out their own people to curry favor with the white establishment. For Robinson, a man who had literally fought his way out of the gutters of Virginia and privately prided himself on his sharp intellect and street-hardened toughness, being branded a subservient coward by his own people was an agony beyond measure. He found himself trapped in a catastrophic crossfire. White Hollywood strictly limited his artistic existence, forcing him to play the fool to earn his keep. Black intellectuals fiercely condemned him for agreeing to play the part. He was completely isolated, surrounded by white audiences who loved a fiction, and black audiences who despised him for performing it. How does a human mind endure such a relentless, grinding dissonance? The historical record reveals a man who coped by constructing a terrifying, self-destructive armor. Off-screen, Robinson actively cultivated an image that was the absolute antithesis of the docile, shuffling characters he played on film. He was notoriously quick-tempered, fiercely proud, and physically intimidating. He refused to back down from a confrontation. If a white patron in a restaurant or a fellow driver on the street offered him the slightest disrespect, the smiling, dancing uncle vanished instantly, replaced by a hardened street fighter who was more than willing to settle disputes with his fists. Yet, fists were not enough to protect a man as visibly wealthy and deeply insecure as Robinson. He required a more potent, lethal symbol of authority to ward off a world he felt was constantly trying to diminish him. He began to carry a firearm. This was not a standard, discreet weapon for personal protection. Robinson carried a magnificent gold-plated revolver, often described as having pearl handles. It was a loud, ostentatious, and incredibly dangerous piece of hardware. He did not keep it hidden in a safe. He carried it on his person, a heavy metallic weight sitting against his tailored suits. Psychologists who have analyzed the lives of early 20th century entertainers point to this golden gun as a profound physical manifestation of his internal trauma. The gun was a desperate reclamation of the masculinity and authority that the film studios systematically stripped from him every time the cameras rolled. He could not control the scripts, he could not control the directors, and he could not control the Southern censors, but he could control the heavy, lethal reality of a loaded revolver. It was a stark warning to the world. The man on the screen is an illusion. The man on the street is armed, powerful, and will not be subjugated. Archival police records confirm that he pulled this weapon on multiple occasions during traffic disputes and heated arguments, leading to arrests and significant legal trouble. The smile was a contract requirement. The golden gun was the bubbling, paranoid reality of his daily existence. However, the gun could only protect him from physical threats. It offered no defense against the crushing psychological weight of his own compromises. To numb the internal pain of the Uncle Tom label and to escape this highly paid subjugation, Robinson turned to a far more insidious coping mechanism. He became a notoriously reckless, compulsive gambler. The sheer scale of his Jabusigis gambling was legendary, even among the hedonistic circles of Hollywood and New York. He did not play for pennies. Robinson was known to wager tens of thousands of dollars on a single horse race, a single boxing match, or a single roll of the dice in illegal subterranean craps games. He would perform a sold-out show, collect an astronomical paycheck, and immediately walk into a gambling den, frequently losing the entire sum before the sun came up. He earned an estimated $2 million during the height of the Great Depression, an incomprehensible fortune at the time, yet he was constantly in debt, constantly borrowing against his future earnings to cover his immediate losses. Financial historians often look at his ledgers with sheer bewilderment, but a closer examination of his psychological state provides a heartbreaking clarity. Many researchers suggest that his catastrophic gambling was not merely a lack of financial discipline, it was a subconscious, desperate act of psychological purging. The money he earned was profoundly tainted. It was the currency of his own humiliation. Every dollar represented a moment he had to swallow his pride, widen his eyes, and play the obedient servant for a white director. The millions he amassed were a constant physical reminder of the dignity he had sold to acquire them. By taking this shameful money and throwing it recklessly across the green felt of a gambling table, he was enacting a chaotic, self-destructive rebellion. He was symbolically washing his hands of the very wealth that tied him to his subjugation. Furthermore, the gambling den offered something that the Hollywood soundstage explicitly denied him: pure, unadulterated equality. At the craps table, the dice were utterly indifferent to the color of his skin. The roulette wheel did not require him to smile, dance, or act subserviently. For the few suspended seconds while the dice tumbled through the air, he was completely free from the suffocating racial politic of America. He was not a black servant or a white master. He was just a man challenging fate. The adrenaline rush of the gamble was the only time he felt a genuine sense of agency, the only time he was truly in control of his own destiny, even if that destiny was financial ruin. This was the quiet, devastating tragedy playing out behind the scenes of his spectacular fame. Bill Robinson was slowly bleeding himself dry. He was a man locked in a brutal war with his own success, using a golden gun to defend a shattered ego, and using the gambling tables to throw away the fortune that he felt he had lost his soul to earn. He was surviving, but he was doing so by systematically destroying the very empire he had built with his own 2 feet. He was trapped in a cycle of earning millions through public humiliation and losing millions in private desperation, all while the world continued to applaud the smiling mask he could never take off. The narrative of the tragic, self-destructive gambler tells only a fraction of the truth. To judge Bill Robinson solely by his public compliance on the silver screen and his private recklessness at the roulette wheel is to fundamentally misunderstand the man. Behind the golden gun and the crushing weight of the Uncle Tom label lay a meticulously hidden reality. The critics who branded him an apologist for white supremacy failed to look beyond the cinema lobbies. They did not see the quiet, strategic warfare he was waging, using the only weapons the system permitted him: his immense wealth and his unparalleled global fame. Bill Robinson was not a passive victim. He was a silent combatant operating deep within enemy territory. His true allegiance, however, was never to the Hollywood sound stages. It belonged to the streets of Upper Manhattan. In the heart of Harlem during the 1930s and 1940s, he was not the subservient butler of studio fiction. He was an absolute monarch. the community affectionately and officially bestowed upon him the T.O. of the honorary mayor of Harlem. This was not a hollow ceremonial gimmick designed for a press photograph. It was a profound recognition of his daily tangible investment in the lives of his people. While the Great Depression ravaged the neighborhood, leaving thousands destitute, Robinson acted as a one-man welfare system. He walked the avenues dispensing cash directly to families facing eviction. He routinely purchased groceries for strangers he saw struggling at the markets. He funded uniforms and equipment for local youth sports teams, keeping young men off the dangerous streets. The most striking and heavily documented example of his direct intervention occurred at the intersection of 155th Street and 7th Avenue. It was a notoriously dangerous crossing, heavily trafficked and entirely unregulated by the city. After witnessing children repeatedly risking their lives to cross the road and seeing the municipal government ignore the pleas of a black neighborhood, Robinson bypassed the bureaucracy entirely. He opened his own checkbook and purchased the city's first traffic light for that specific intersection. He paid for its installation and its maintenance. He did not petition the white establishment for safety. He simply bought it for his people. His philanthropy was staggering in its scale and sheer physical endurance. Financial historians and biographers have examined the remnants of his estate and estimated that throughout his lifetime, Robinson performed in upwards of 3,000 benefit concerts entirely free of charge. After completing exhausting schedules of 3 or 4 shows a day for paying white audiences, he would frequently travel across the city in the dead of night to perform a 5th show for a hospital, an orphanage, or a civil rights organization. He raised millions of dollars for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He was a pillar of funding for the very community that sometimes publicly shunned him. He is the vast fortune he did not lose at the gambling tables. He poured directly back into the streets that had raised him. He understood inherently that true power in America was economic, and he used his fortune as a financial shield for a disenfranchised population. However, his activism extended far beyond writing checks. He used his unique, unprecedented access to the white establishment to force structural change, albeit behind closed doors and away from the flashbulbs of the press. He weaponized his box office draw to dismantle racial barriers in places where the law explicitly demanded segregation. A striking example of this leverage occurred in Miami, Florida. The American South was strictly legally segregated, and theaters enforced a rigid, humiliating separation of audiences. Black patrons, if permitted entry at all, were routinely confined to cramped, unsafe balconies, forced to enter through side doors. Robinson understood his commercial value. Theater owners knew that booking him guaranteed a sold-out venue. Leveraging this immense economic power, historical archives indicate he outright refused to perform at a prominent Miami theater unless the management agreed to dismantle the racial barriers for his shows. He presented them with a stark choice: integrate the seating or lose the most profitable act in the country. He forced the theater to allow white and black patrons to sit shoulder to shoulder. It was a temporary victory, applicable only for the duration of his engagement. But in the hostile heart of Jim Crow territory, forcing integration through sheer economic willpower was an act of profound, calculated defiance. When the Second World War erupted, the hypocrisy of the American establishment was magnified to a grotesque degree. The nation asked its black citizens to bleed on foreign soil for a democratic freedom they were legally denied at home. The United States military remained strictly segregated. Black soldiers were routinely subjected to degradee, treatment relegated to menial labor, and housed in inferior conditions. Robinson did not merely entertain these troops to boost morale, though he did perform tirelessly at military bases across the country. He took his grievances to the absolute pinnacle of American power. Utilizing the relationships and the unthreatening persona he had cultivated over decades of stardom, he secured direct access to the Oval Office. Documents preserved by historical institutions reveal that Robinson met with President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He did not go to the White House to tap dance. He went to fiercely protest the horrific treatment of black servicemen in the armed forces. He advocated for their dignity, their safety, and their right to fight as equals. This was an extraordinarily dangerous political maneuver. A black entertainer openly challenging the commander-in-chief during the wartime over issues of race risked immediate total cancellation. A single leak to the press framing him as unpatriotic or demanding would have ended his career overnight. Yet, Robinson pressed the issue. He used the smiling, amiable mask of Bojangles to bypass the gatekeepers and gain entry into the halls of power. Once inside, with the doors closed, he spoke with the firm, uncompromising authority of a civil rights advocate. He lobbied the Dallas Police Department to hire its first black officers, using his celebrity influence to push the local government into compliance. The New York Police Department recognized his immense influence in Harlem by making him a special deputy, a badge he carried with immense pride alongside his golden revolver. This was the complex, dual existence of Bill Robinson. It was a life built entirely upon a strategic, agonizing compromise. He allowed the white public to believe he was a happy, simple, tap-dancing servant, because that very illusion paid for the ammunition he needed for his quiet war. He traded his public dignity for private leverage. He endured the mocking laughter of cinema audiences so he could fund the hospitals that healed his people. He swallowed the bitter insults of the younger radicalized generation so he could continue lobbying the president for their civil rights. He was a pioneer who recognized a harsh, undeniable truth of his era. A frontal vocal assault on white supremacy would lead to his immediate destruction and the loss of his platform. Therefore, he chose infiltration. He smuggled his activism through the back door, wrapped in a syncopated rhythm and a brilliant smile. He fought the system from the inside out, using their own money and their own stages to slowly chip away at the walls of segregation. It was a lonely, thankless, and deeply misunderstood strategy. But it was a strategy nonetheless. It proved definitively that beneath the veneer of the compliant celluloid servant beat the heart of a fiercely dedicated, fiercely loyal man. He had played the game perfectly, extracting millions from a system designed to crush him. But as the 1940s drew to a close, the system would finally realize it no longer needed him to play. The tragedy of the human body is that it holds no reverence for genius. Tap dancing is not merely an art form. It is a punishing athletic pursuit. It demands an absolute, uncompromising synchronization of muscle, breath, and bone. For decades, Bill Robinson had defied gravity and age, maintaining a physical brilliance that masked the passing of time. But as the 1940s drew to a close and Robinson entered his late 60s, the inevitable betrayal of the flesh began. The legendary rapid-fire conversations his feet once held with the floorboards started to lose their crisp, articulate edge. The physical elevation that defined the stair dance, that effortless, aristocratic posture, required a stamina that was slowly, irreversibly draining away. He was developing chronic heart disease. The engine that had driven him out of the gutters of Virginia was finally beginning to fail. The American entertainment machine, particularly the Hollywood studio system, operates devoid of sentimentality. It is a purely transactional architecture. The studios had tolerated his presence and paid him millions, solely because his physical perfection generated astronomical profits. They had never valued him as a dramatic actor, nor had they ever viewed him as a human being worthy of long-term investment. The moment his feet began to slow, the moment the physical product he offered showed signs of degradation, the system reacted with terrifying clinical coldness. The telephone simply stopped ringing. The lucrative film contracts were not renewed. There was no transition into dignified elder statesman roles, because Hollywood had never written a dignified role for a black man in the first place. He was discarded. Furthermore, the industry offered absolutely no safety net for the pioneers it exploited. There were no pension plans for aging vaudeville stars. There was no comprehensive health insurance provided by the studios that had profited so handsomely from his youth. As his medical bills mounted, the catastrophic reality of his financial situation was laid bare. The millions of dollars he had earned during the Great Depression had entirely evaporated. The fortune was gone, scattered across the green felt of illegal craps tables, poured into the hands of destitute families in Harlem, and quietly absorbed by a managerial structure that frequently took advantage of black artists. The bitter irony of his final years is almost too painful to articulate. Here was a man who had personally purchased traffic lights to keep the children of his neighborhood safe, a man who had funded hospitals and bought groceries for thousands of strangers. Yet as he lay dying in a hospital bed in New York City, struggling to breathe as his heart gave out, he could not afford his own medical care. The honorary mayor of Harlem, the man who had danced with Shirley Temple and lobbied the president of the United States, was destitute. He had given away his wealth to protect his people, and he had gambled away the rest to protect his sanity. He was left with nothing but an ailing body and a legacy that the intellectual elite of his own community was actively attempting to dismantle. On the 25th of November, 1949, the rhythmic pulse of Bill Bojangles Robinson stopped forever. He died of heart failure at the age of 71. At the exact moment of his death, his financial assets were entirely non-existent. The highest-paid black entertainer of his generation, a man whose image had generated untold wealth for white studio executives, died an absolute pauper. He did not even possess enough money to secure a plot of earth for his own burial. It was a profound, concluding humiliation. The responsibility of burying this American giant fell not to the film studios he had enriched, but to his personal friends. Ed Sullivan, the prominent television host alongside civic leaders in Harlem, had to publicly solicit donations and organize a collection just to ensure Robinson was not buried in an unmarked pauper's grave. The system had taken his art, taken his dignity on film, taken his youth, and finally it had ensured he left the world with empty pockets. If the story ended in that hospital room, it would be a narrative of absolute unredeemed defeat. But history is rarely written by studio executives or cultural critics. The final verdict on the life of Bill Robinson was not delivered by the intellectuals who called him an Uncle Tom, nor was it delivered by the Southern censors who cut him from their films. The final verdict was delivered by the streets. When the news of his passing reached the avenues of New York, a seismic, unspoken shift occurred. The city did not merely mourn an entertainer, it halted completely to to honor a sovereign. His body was laid in state at the 369th Infantry Regiment Armory in Harlem. For days, an endless silent river of humanity flowed past his open casket. Official records estimate that 32,000 people waited in the freezing November air just to look upon his face one last time. Then came the day of the funeral procession. It was an event of staggering, unprecedented magnitude. As the hearse slowly made its way down 7th Avenue toward the cemetery, the world witnessed the true measure of what he had meant to the people. 500,000 citizens stood shoulder to shoulder, packing the pavements, hanging from fire escapes, and crowding the rooftops. Public schools in the area closed their doors so children could bear witness. The police department, which he had helped integrate, provided an honor guard. It was not a chaotic crowd. It was a deeply reverent, profoundly sorrowful congregation. Black and white, wealthy and destitute, they stood together in the bitter cold, weeping for a man who had danced his way through an era of unimaginable cruelty. Those 500,000 people did not gather to mourn a happy servant or a compromised sellout. They gathered because they understood the brutal, unspoken mathematics of his survival. They knew that in an era when a black man could be lynched simply for looking a white man in the eye, Bill Robinson had found a way to become a millionaire, an icon, and a quiet philanthropist. They understood that he had worn a humiliating, smiling mask as on the silver screen so that he could use the Hollywood treasury to feed the hungry in Harlem. He absorbed the venom of a racist society. He swallowed his own immense pride. He did this to subversively wedge the door open for those who would follow. He was not a coward. He was a bridge. He was a man who allowed himself to be stepped upon by the culture of his time, knowing that his posture, his immaculate timing, and his undeniable genius were slowly elevating the dignity of his race. As the hearse vanished into the distance, leaving 500,000 weeping citizens in its wake, the bitter paradox of his life was finally resolved. The entertainment machine had managed to strip him of his wealth and caricature, his image, but it completely failed to claim his soul. Ultimately, was this man who taught America to dance a complete victim of dishonor, or a great pioneer who had to swallow his ego for the survival of an entire generation? The silent tears of Harlem provided the only answer that mattered. He was a legend who sacrificed himself so that the rhythm of his people would never be silenced.